Picture a quiet tent nestled in the wilderness, away from the battlefield and the chaos of war. The wind gently rustles the fabric, and inside, a woman is faced with a decision that will change the course of history. This is the story of Jael, an unlikely heroine who, with nothing more than a tent peg and unwavering faith, became the instrument of God's justice for Israel. In today's message, we will uncover the remarkable story of how God used Jael, a woman who appeared far removed from the conflict, to defeat a powerful enemy. Her courage and obedience are not only inspiring, but also a reminder that God can use anyone, no matter how ordinary, to fulfill His extraordinary plans. Together, we'll explore how Jael's actions teach us about faith, bravery, and the power of trusting in God's purpose for our lives. As you read, allow Jael's story to encourage you in your own journey of faith. Whether you are facing a difficult decision or simply wondering how God might use you, her story is a powerful reminder that with God, even the smallest act of obedience can bring about great victories. Jael's story begins in a time of uncertainty and fear. Israel was under the oppressive rule of King Jabin of Canaan, and his army, led by the ruthless commander Sisera, terrorized the land. Amidst the chaos, Jael emerges as an unexpected figure in God's plan for deliverance. She wasn't a warrior or a leader. She was a humble woman living in a tent, seemingly far from the front lines of battle. Yet in God's hands, she would become the heroine no one anticipated. This reminds us of how often God uses the least likely individuals to fulfill His purposes. Jael's background didn't seem fit for the role she played in Israel's deliverance, but her heart and her willingness were all God needed. Like Jael, we might feel unqualified or insignificant in the grander scheme of things, but God sees beyond our limitations. He sees our potential when we are willing to act in faith. Jael's tent was a place of refuge, not just for her family, but for weary travelers. It was here, in the quiet of her domestic life, that she was called to make a life-altering decision. God often works in the ordinary moments of our lives, preparing us for extraordinary acts of faith. Jael didn't have time to second-guess her actions. When the moment came, she was ready to do what was necessary. As the tension builds, we begin to understand the depth of courage required to do what Jael did. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was about to strike a blow for her entire nation. Fear might have tempted her to remain passive, but instead, she chose to act decisively. Her story is a testament to the power of stepping into the role God has prepared for us, even when it feels overwhelming. This leads us to reflect on how we handle moments of decision in our lives. Do we shy away in fear, or do we trust that God has placed us in the right position at the right time? Jael's strength wasn't in her physical ability, but in her spiritual readiness. She trusted that the Lord was with her, and that made all the difference. As Jael's story unfolds, we see the power of one woman's courage and faith. Her actions would change the course of history, but at this moment, she was simply obeying the call on her heart. It's a powerful reminder that our faithfulness in small acts can have ripple effects we may never fully see. The backdrop of Jael's story is a time of deep distress for the people of Israel. For 20 long years, they had suffered under the oppressive rule of King Jabin, a Canaanite king whose army, led by Sisera, held them in fear. The Israelites were outmatched in every way. Sisera's army had 900 iron chariots, a force Israel could not contend with. This period of suffering had left the people desperate, crying out to God for deliverance. They longed for relief, but the situation seemed hopeless. In times of desperation, it is easy to feel like God has forgotten us. The Israelites must have questioned why they were left to suffer for so long. Yet, as we often see in Scripture, God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own. In their darkest hour, God was already preparing a way out for His people. Just as He used Moses to deliver Israel from Egypt, He would now use an unexpected source, Jael, to deliver them from Sisera's grip. Deborah, the prophetess and judge of Israel, had already prophesied victory. She had told Barak, the commander of Israel's army, that God would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. At first glance, many would have assumed Deborah was speaking of herself. But as we know, God's plans often take surprising turns. Jael, a seemingly ordinary woman, would be the one to fulfill this prophecy, proving that God's ways are higher than ours. In moments of hardship, we often ask why certain trials come our way. Israel's long period of oppression seemed unbearable, but it set the stage for a mighty act of deliverance. God doesn't waste our suffering. He uses it to prepare us for greater victories. Just as he was working behind the scenes in Israel's time of desperation, he is at work in our lives even when we can't see it. As we reflect on Jael's role in this story, we are reminded that God's deliverance doesn't always come from the places we expect. The people of Israel might have hoped for a strong warrior to rise up and defeat Sisera. Instead, God chose a woman living in a tent to be the instrument of his salvation. This teaches us that God's plans often defy human logic, and his solutions may come from the most unlikely sources. For those who feel like they are living in their own desperate times, Jael's story offers hope. No matter how long the trial or how hopeless the situation appears, God is at work. He is preparing the way for deliverance, and he may use us even when we feel inadequate or unseen. Jael didn't seek the spotlight, but she was ready when the time came to act. Jael's moment of decision came when Sisera, the feared commander, fled to her tent seeking refuge. Exhausted and desperate, he believed Jael's tent to be a safe haven. Her husband, Heber, had made peace with King Jabin, Sisera's master, and Sisera likely assumed that Jael would honor that alliance. But Jael had another plan, one guided by divine purpose. In an instant, she made the bold decision to betray Sisera's trust and align herself with the God of Israel. It's remarkable to consider the courage it took for Jael to make this choice. She knew the risks. To turn against Sisera could have cost her everything, including her life. Yet Jael's decision wasn't based on fear, but on faith. She sensed the greater plan at work and acted in accordance with God's will. Her boldness in the face of danger stands as a testament to how faith empowers us to take action, even when the risks are high. In life, we all face moments where bold decisions must be made. Often, these decisions come when we least expect them, and they may involve going against the expectations of others. Like Jael, we may find ourselves in situations where the easy path would be to stay silent or passive. But God calls us to live courageously, trusting him even when the outcome is uncertain. Jael teaches us that, with faith, we can make decisions that not only change our lives, but also the lives of those around us. Sisera's entry into Jael's tent symbolizes how the enemy often seeks refuge in places where we feel most comfortable or secure. The enemy of our faith may disguise itself in forms that seem harmless, much like Sisera did when he sought rest in Jael's tent. But through discernment, Jael recognized that Sisera was not her ally. She made the difficult choice to stand against him, knowing that it was the right thing to do. In our own lives, we too are called to recognize the hidden dangers that seek to disrupt our faith journey. As Jael offered Sisera milk to soothe him, she appeared to be offering him comfort. But behind her actions, a divine strategy was unfolding. Sometimes, the choices we make may seem small or insignificant, but they are part of a larger plan. Jael's quiet act of offering milk to Sisera was the beginning of his downfall, showing us that God works through the simplest actions to bring about his purpose. If this message touched your heart, share in the comments how faith has guided your journey. Or simply comment the word hope to let us know you are with us on this spiritual path. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that inspires and strengthens your walk with God. The moment Jael picked up the tent peg and hammer, the weight of her decision became clear. With these simple tools, she carried out an act of justice that would free Israel from years of oppression. As Sisera lay asleep, exhausted from battle, Jael approached quietly, her heart likely pounding with anticipation. In one swift motion, she drove the tent peg through his temple, ending his life and securing Israel's victory. It was an act that would forever change the course of Israel's history. The tent peg, an ordinary object used to secure a tent, became a symbol of deliverance in God's hands. This reminds us that God can use the most unassuming tools in our lives to bring about His justice and His will. Jael didn't need weapons or an army. She used what was available to her. God often provides us with exactly what we need to accomplish His purposes, even if it seems insignificant at first. Jael's act of bravery challenges us to consider how we respond when God calls us to act. It wasn't her strength or skill that made her victorious. It was her willingness to be used by God. The tent peg wasn't powerful on its own, but in the hands of a faithful servant, it became an instrument of justice. Likewise, the tools we possess, whether they be talents, resources, or opportunities, can be used by God when we are willing to step out in faith. As we reflect on this moment, we also see how God's justice prevailed. Sisera had terrorized Israel for years, and his defeat was inevitable because God had already ordained it. Jael was simply the vessel through which God's justice was delivered. In our lives, we may face situations where injustice seems to prevail. But Jael's story assures us that God's justice is always at work. It may not come in the way we expect, but it will come in His perfect timing. The act of driving the tent peg into Sisera's head was not only a physical victory, but a spiritual one. It signified the end of Israel's oppression and the beginning of their freedom. In the same way, when we face spiritual battles, God equips us to overcome. The tent peg of justice reminds us that no matter how overwhelming the enemy may seem, God's power is greater, and He will bring victory in His time. As we move forward in Jael's story, we see how her act of courage paved the way for Israel's peace. It wasn't just a moment of personal triumph, it was a victory for an entire nation. Jael's willingness to act became a turning point for her people, showing us that one act of faith can have a ripple effect far beyond what we imagine. Jael's household had an unusual alliance with King Jabin, Sisera's master. Her husband, Heber, was a Kenite, and the Kenites had made peace with the Canaanite king. This alliance put Jael in a precarious position, living among a people who were enemies of Israel, yet married to a man who had chosen peace with the very force oppressing her people. It would have been easy for Jael to remain neutral, keeping her distance from the conflict. But instead, she took a stand that would break the ties of this dangerous alliance and align herself with God's people. This part of Jael's story illustrates the tension many of us feel when we are caught between two worlds. We may find ourselves in situations where we are tempted to compromise or remain silent, particularly when it feels like taking a stand would cost us something. Jael could have stayed loyal to her husband's peace treaty, but she knew that doing so would mean turning her back on God's greater plan. Her choice to align herself with Israel, despite the personal risk, shows the importance of loyalty to God above all else. We often encounter our own dangerous alliances in life, relationships, beliefs, or habits that pull us away from God's purposes. Like Jael, we must discern when it is time to break away from these ties and stand firm in our faith. It's not always easy, and it can come with consequences, but God honors our commitment to Him when we choose to follow His leading, even in the face of opposition. Jael's courage reminds us that we are not defined by the decisions of those around us. Though her husband had made peace with Jabin, she did not let that decision define her loyalty. Each of us is responsible for our own faith journey, and we are called to make choices that align with God's will, regardless of the expectations or pressures from those around us. Jael didn't let her husband's alliance dictate her actions, and in doing so, she became a key figure in Israel's deliverance. This part of Jael's story also highlights the power of personal integrity. Even in a situation where she was surrounded by enemies, Jael stayed true to what she believed was right. It takes great integrity to go against the grain, especially when the consequences could be severe. But Jael's integrity paved the way for a greater victory, reminding us that God values our faithfulness and will use it for his purposes. As Jael made her choice to stand with God's people, she unknowingly set in motion the defeat of Sisera and the freedom of Israel. Her decision was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for an entire nation. It's a powerful reminder that our choices, even when they seem small, can have far-reaching effects when aligned with God's plan. As Jael's tent became the setting for a divine victory, Sisera's defeat was imminent. His escape from battle had been swift, but his fate had already been sealed by God's hand. Sisera, a man who had caused so much terror and destruction, was now at the mercy of a single woman, a striking contrast to the mighty army he commanded. His defeat wasn't in the open battlefield, but in the quiet, unexpected space of Jael's tent. This is where God's justice met Sisera, and Jael became the instrument of that justice. Sisera's downfall reminds us of the limits of human power. Though he commanded great armies and was feared throughout the land, his strength was no match for God's plan. In our lives, we often face giants that seem unbeatable, whether they are circumstances, people, or internal battles. Yet Jael's story shows us that when God is involved, no enemy is too strong, and no situation is too dire. God can bring victory in the most unexpected ways and through the most unlikely people. As Sisera lay dead in Jael's tent, it marked the turning point for Israel's deliverance. For years, Sisera had oppressed God's people, but his defeat brought a new era of peace and freedom. This moment symbolizes how God intervenes in the most decisive ways to bring about his will. The enemy that once seemed unstoppable was now gone, and Israel could begin to heal from the years of suffering. It serves as a reminder that God's timing and justice are perfect, even when we don't understand the delays. Jael's role in this victory wasn't just a personal act of bravery, it was part of God's larger plan for Israel. Through her faithfulness, the prophecy of Deborah was fulfilled, and Sisera's defeat became a testament to God's sovereignty. In our lives, we may not always see how our actions fit into God's grand design, but we can trust that He is working through us when we are obedient to His call. Sisera's defeat also highlights the importance of divine intervention in our battles. Jael's success wasn't due to her own strength or cunning alone. It was God's power working through her that brought victory. This is an important reminder for us. We don't face life's challenges alone. When we are aligned with God's will, He fights our battles, and His strength becomes our strength. As Israel celebrated the downfall of their enemy, they also celebrated the faithfulness of God. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Jael, but for an entire nation that had been waiting for deliverance. Jael's story is a powerful illustration of how God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things for His glory. As Jael's story unfolds, we can clearly see that her actions were part of a much larger plan orchestrated by God. Long before Jael made her bold decision, God had already set the stage for Sisera's defeat. Deborah had prophesied that a woman would bring an end to Sisera's reign of terror, and though many may have thought that woman would be Deborah herself, God had someone else in mind. Jael, seemingly far removed from the center of the conflict, was positioned perfectly to fulfill her role in God's plan. It's often said that God works in mysterious ways, and Jael's story is a perfect example of this truth. No one would have expected the downfall of Sisera to come from a woman living in a tent, but God sees what we cannot. He works behind the scenes, putting the right people in the right places at the right times. Jael may not have known it, but her entire life had been preparing her for this moment. In the same way, we may not always see how God is using our circumstances to prepare us for His purposes, but we can trust that He is always at work. This reminds us that nothing in our lives is wasted. Even the most ordinary moments, like Jael's life in the tent, are part of God's grand design. When we live in obedience and faith, we allow God to use us in ways we never imagined. Jael didn't have the qualifications of a warrior or a leader, but she had the heart of someone willing to follow God's prompting. This is what made her a key figure in Israel's victory, and it's what God looks for in us today. God's plan for Israel's deliverance wasn't just about defeating Sisera. It was about restoring peace and hope to His people. Jael's actions were part of that restoration process. Through her obedience, the people of Israel saw God's hand at work, reminding them that He had not forgotten them. In our own lives, when we see God's plan in motion, it often brings with it a renewed sense of hope and purpose. Even in the darkest times, God's light shines through, reminding us that He is always in control. As we consider how God's plan unfolded in Jael's story, we are reminded of the importance of trusting His timing. Israel had suffered under Sisera for many years, but God's deliverance came at the perfect time. Jael didn't rush into action. She waited for the right moment, and when it came, she acted decisively. This teaches us that patience and faith are key in seeing God's plan come to fruition in our own lives. Jael's story is a testament to the fact that God's plan is always in motion, even when we don't see it. He works through ordinary people and everyday situations to bring about extraordinary outcomes. Jael's obedience played a crucial role in fulfilling God's promise to Israel, and her story reminds us that when we trust in God's plan, we become part of something much bigger than ourselves. Jael's courage in the face of danger was remarkable. It wasn't her physical strength that made her a hero, but her unwavering faith and bravery in a moment of great risk. The decision to strike down Sisera wasn't one she made lightly, but it was fueled by her trust in God's plan. Jael didn't have the security of knowing how everything would turn out. She only knew that she needed to act when the opportunity presented itself. Her story is a powerful reminder of the vital role that courage and faith play in fulfilling God's purpose. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward in spite of it. Jael likely experienced fear as she approached Sisera with the tent peg in hand, but her faith allowed her to push past it. In our own lives, we often face situations that require us to step out in faith, even when fear threatens to hold us back. Jael's story teaches us that courage is about trusting God more than our own doubts. And it's in those moments of trust that we see His power at work. Faith, too, played a central role in Jael's actions. She didn't have all the answers, and she couldn't foresee the outcome, but she believed that God was with her. Her faith gave her the strength to carry out what seemed like an impossible task. This is a powerful lesson for us. When we are aligned with God's will, our faith can move mountains, even when we feel inadequate or unsure. Jael's courage wasn't just about the physical act of killing Sisera. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it meant going against the expectations of those around her. She could have remained passive, content to live in peace with Sisera as her guest, but her faith in God's justice spurred her to act. Her story challenges us to examine how we respond when we are called to take a stand. Do we act with the courage that comes from faith, or do we let fear and complacency hold us back? We also see in Jael's story that courage and faith are contagious. Her boldness inspired others and became a symbol of victory for Israel. When we act courageously in faith, it can have a ripple effect, encouraging those around us to do the same. Jael's actions remind us that we are part of a larger community of believers, and our faithfulness can inspire others to trust God more deeply in their own lives. Ultimately, Jael's story shows us that courage and faith go hand in hand. It was her faith in God that gave her the courage to act, and her courage that allowed her faith to shine through. In the same way, we are called to live lives of faith that are marked by courageous action. When we trust God and step out in faith, we allow Him to work through us in ways that can change the course of history. Jael's courageous act left an indelible mark on the history of Israel. Her name was immortalized in the Song of Deborah, a triumphant hymn that celebrated Israel's victory over Sisera. Deborah, the prophetess and judge, praised Jael as most blessed of women, placing her alongside other great women of the Bible, such as Miriam and Ruth. This recognition highlights Jael's pivotal role in God's plan and underscores the impact of her actions on her people and their future. Jael's legacy is one of faithfulness, courage, and obedience to God's will. Though her moment of decision was brief, its effects were far-reaching. Israel's victory over Sisera marked the beginning of a period of peace that lasted for 40 years, and Jael's role in securing that peace was remembered and honored for generations. Her story serves as a reminder that even the smallest acts of faith can have profound and lasting consequences. In reflecting on Jael's legacy, we see that she wasn't just a woman who acted bravely in a single moment. She was a part of God's greater story of redemption for His people. Her willingness to be used by God, even in a dangerous and uncertain situation, made her an instrument of His justice and mercy. Jael's story encourages us to consider how our own lives are part of God's ongoing work in the world. When we step out in faith, we participate in His plan to bring healing, justice, and peace. Jael's legacy also speaks to the power of women in the Bible and their often unexpected roles in shaping the course of history. While many of the heroes of Scripture are men, women like Jael remind us that God's purposes are not limited by gender or societal roles. He uses women in powerful ways to accomplish His will, and Jael stands as a testament to the strength and faith of women who trust in God. Her story is an encouragement to women today to live boldly in faith, knowing that God can use them in extraordinary ways. The inclusion of Jael's story in Israel's history also reminds us that God sees and honors the faithfulness of His people. Jael wasn't a queen or a prophetess, but her actions were no less significant in God's eyes. This teaches us that we don't have to hold a position of power or prestige to make a difference. God uses ordinary people, like Jael, to do extraordinary things when they are willing to follow His lead. As we reflect on Jael's legacy, we are reminded of the power of one person's faith and courage. Her story has been told for centuries, inspiring countless others to live with the same boldness and trust in God's plan. Jael's legacy in Israel's history is not just about the defeat of Sisera. It's about the triumph of faith over fear and the lasting impact one person can have when they step out in obedience to God. Jael's story is filled with valuable lessons that resonate with us today, reminding us of the power of faith, courage, and obedience to God's calling. One of the most striking lessons we can learn from Jael is that God can use anyone, regardless of their background or status, to fulfill His purposes. Jael was not a soldier or a leader. She was a woman living in a tent on the outskirts of a major conflict. Yet, when the moment came, she was ready to act decisively for God's people. This teaches us that no matter where we find ourselves in life, God can work through us if we are willing. Another important lesson from Jael's story is the significance of courage in the face of fear. Jael's decision to act against Sisera required immense bravery, She knew the risks, yet her faith in God gave her the strength to overcome her fear. This is a powerful reminder that when we face difficult or dangerous situations, we can rely on God's strength to give us the courage we need. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to trust in God's plan despite our fear. Jael's story also highlights the importance of discerning the right moment to act. Timing was crucial in Jael's victory over Sisera. She didn't act rashly or out of panic, but with careful consideration. This teaches us the value of patience and waiting for the right moment to carry out God's will. Often, we may feel pressure to act immediately, but Jael's story reminds us that God's timing is perfect, and when we trust in Him, He will show us when and how to move. Obedience is another key theme in Jael's story. Her willingness to follow God's leading, even when it meant going against societal expectations, shows us the importance of placing God's will above all else. Jael could have chosen to remain neutral, honoring her husband's alliance with Sisera, but instead she chose to obey God and align herself with His people. This lesson challenges us to prioritize our loyalty to God above any other ties or relationships in our lives. Finally, Jael's story teaches us about the far-reaching effects of our faithfulness. Her single act of courage didn't just change her life, it changed the course of history for the nation of Israel. Often, we may not realize the impact our decisions have on others, but when we act in obedience to God, He can use our faithfulness to bring about transformation far beyond what we imagine. Jael's story encourages us to trust that God is working through our small acts of faith to accomplish His greater purposes. In reflecting on Jael's life, we are reminded that God calls each of us to live with faith, courage, and obedience. Her story is a timeless reminder that when we trust in God and act in faith, we can become instruments of His justice and mercy in the world. Jael's story may be brief, but its impact is profound. Her courage, faith, and obedience are timeless examples of how God works through those who are willing to trust in Him. She reminds us that even in the quiet, seemingly insignificant moments of life, God can call us to extraordinary acts of faith. Jael's legacy is one of triumph, not just over an enemy of Israel, but over fear, doubt, and uncertainty. Her faithfulness brought peace to an entire nation, and her story continues to inspire us today. As we reflect on the lessons from Jael's life, let's remember that God calls each of us to live with that same courage and faith. We may not face a Sisera in our daily lives, but we do face challenges and decisions that require us to step out in obedience. And just like Jael, we are never alone in those moments. God is with us, guiding our steps and providing the strength we need to accomplish His will. Let us pray together. Heavenly Father, thank You for the story of Jael, a woman who trusted in You even when the risks were great. Help us to have that same courage and faith in our lives. Teach us to recognize the moments when You call us to act, and give us the strength to follow Your will, no matter the cost. May we be instruments of Your justice and peace in the world. Amen. If this message has inspired you, I encourage you to share it with friends and family who may need to hear these words. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith and encouragement that will uplift your spirit. Together, let's continue to walk in faith, trusting that God has a plan for each of us.